Continuing along with the setup for Plato's line in the allegory of the cave, Plato discusses the objects of knowledge, talking once again about the many and the one. He claims there is a many beautiful and a many good, and so too for everything described and defined. To them the term many is applied, but he also holds there is an absolute beauty, an absolute good, and for all the things to which the term many is applied, there is an absolute. And on his metaphysics, each many, like cats for example, or dogs, they are under a single form, the essence of each. So all cats under the form of cat, all dogs under the form of dog, all just acts under the form of justice. And as Plato sees it, the many are seen but not known. The forms are known but not seen. And given his talk about seeing, it certainly makes sense that he turns to an analogy involving the eye. So here's how his analogy goes. In moonlight and starlight, the eyes see dimly. In the sunshine, the eyes see clearly. And he says, in the analogy, the soul is like the eye. When resting on what truth and being shine, the soul perceives, understands, and has intelligence. When turned towards the twilight of becoming and perishing, she has opinion and seems to lack intelligence. And so in this analogy, the physical world is like a world illuminated by moonlight and starlight that can only be seen poorly and dimly. And the world of the forms is like the world of bright sunlight. It can be seen clearly. And again, this is a metaphor. Plato, of course, says that you can't see the forms, you somehow know them, in kind of an unclear, way as to how that all works. Now, given he talks about the sun, not surprising, more sun. So the sun analogy goes like this. What imparts truth to the known and the power of knowing to the knower is the idea of good. And he says light and sight are like the sun, but not the sun. So science and truth are like the good, but not the good. And for Plato, the good is a higher place of honor. Now, one of the big debates in ethics throughout forever has been what is the good? And one thing that both Plato and Aristotle and many other thinkers agree on is that pleasure is not the good. And of course there are those who think the opposite. For example, our good dead friend John Stuart Mill will claim the exact opposite. But getting back to the sun. Now in the physical world, the sun is the author of visibility, generation, nourishment, and growth. But the sun is not generation. In a like manner, according to Plato, continuing his analogy, the good is the author of knowledge to all things known and of their being and essence. But the good is not essence, but far exceeds essence in dignity and power. And the analogy here to God is pretty evident. Although for Plato the good is not a being that loves and cares for people, and it's not like it's not a infinite being with all of the infinite perfect qualities, it does clearly occupy a very similar role to God. And you could, if you want to flip that around, you could also say that the role of God in monotheistic faiths is rather similar to Plato's good. And not surprisingly, some thinkers in the past have claimed that Plato was anticipating monotheism, but kind of got it wrong because he was a pagan. And others say that monotheism is stolen from Plato. And there's endless debate about that. But pressing on to the line. Now drawn out, Plato's line looks like this. Unlike the normal grading scale, A is the worst, D is the very best. And the line is of unequal lengths. So if you're wondering, hey, did he draw the line kind of badly? And no, it's actually in Plato's description, that's how the line works. Segment D, and C, and B are smaller than A, so the proportions are correct. So what's going on with the line? Well, here's what's going on with the line. So for Plato, there are 4 levels in his epistemology, and there are 2 ruling powers, the good over the intellectual world, the sun over the visible world, and he draws a distinction between what is visible, what's in the material world, and what is intelligible. So he says, take a line, cut it into two unequal parts, and divide each again, and the two main divisions correspond to the visible and the intelligible. So A and B, visible. C and D, intelligible. Continuing along with the line, each of the segments. So for Plato, segment A is the least of segments. It is just above nothing. And the faculty here is imagination. And what exists here, what dwells at this level, would be shadows, images, reflections, illusions, things that are just barely more than nothing. And also for Plato, art would live here as well. And if you take the class in aesthetics, or are familiar with Book 10 of Plato's Republic, he is very critical of art. And one of the reasons why is because he thinks that it is among the least of things. It is an imitation of an imitation. And he has other reasons as well, but we won't go into them here. Now moving on up to segment B, we have the faculty of belief, and this is the realm of physical objects. So, using as an example, a drawing of a pizza would be in segment A. It would be an imitation of a pizza. An actual pizza for Plato would be at level B, but it would still be an imitation. How so? Well, this moves us on up to segments C and D. So, C and D are in the realm of the intelligible, the world of things you can know. So at segment C, you have the faculty of thinking, and the objects for Plato would be what are sometimes called the lower forms, and also the mathematicals. But there's considerable debate about, exactly what Plato meant by lower forms and mathematicals, and even within Plato's works, there's some inconsistency. So, how does level C work? Well, according to Plato, speaking through Socrates, what happens is this. In level C, we work with a hypothesis, and we use figures to think of these forms. So kind of the hallmark of section C is this. First, it involves using, we could say, symbols. Think, for example, of mathematics. You have variables and numbers, or think of logic, where you have also variables and connectives. And so we use symbols and figures. Or as another example, think of geometry, when we use drawings of circles and squares, etc. So uses figures. Secondly, it begins with a hypothesis and involves taking steps. So think of like a proof in logic, or a proof in geometry, or a series of steps in doing a mathematical problem. So the hallmark of level C is, or the two hallmarks are, one, we do use symbols and images, and secondly, it involves what we could classify as deductive reasoning. You go through a series of steps. And for Plato, this does involve, knowledge. Now, level D, the highest idea, the highest of the realms, does not use images and does not involve going through these deductive steps of reasoning. So, how does that level work? Well, according to Plato, at segment D, what you've got going on is this. You attain knowledge of it, and it's intelligible, but you don't use, you don't use the symbols, you don't use the deductive steps. You are you see it. You're illuminated. And this, of course, leads to all kinds of later problems when you talk about, the light of reason or the natural light. And then there's a challenge of, well, how do you tell when it's the natural light illuminating it and showing the truth, and when one is like hallucinating or on drugs, etc. Now, at the sea level, you have, rational deductive steps. You can lay out your work, etc., and see all the steps. But the level above that is this somehow rational intuition, this light of reason. And that creates a lot of problems, throughout history. Now, to each of these levels corresponds a particular faculty. For the highest level, there would be what Plato calls rational intuition. You don't rely on these assumptions of visual aids. You simply see, the truth. And again, that's as problematic as it sounds, because if you're just seeing this illuminated truth, it's really hard to prove that. And later thinkers like John Locke point out that people can be very misled by strong feelings, thinking they're seeing the light. The understanding deals with the level of, the C level, belief for the B level, and imagining or imagination for the lowest level. So that would take us through most of the line. Now, he brings up, of course, the good once again. And for Plato, the good would be the first principle of the whole, the ultimate source of knowledge and reality. And again, he draws a lot of analogies between this and the sun. And the good goes beyond these partial truths that words can convey, and we understand it through a sort of enlightenment. And again, this is important to note because it becomes a big problem going forward. How do you distinguish between being enlightened and just being fanatical or being crazy? And philosophers really haven't come up with a clear way of distinguishing between them. Next, we'll head to Plato's famous allegory of the cave.